Good afternoon, everyone. It's Luke Schwartz, and you're watching Sports with Schwartz. Thanks for tuning in. We've all seen franchises come and go. We saw the Charlotte Hornets from 2001 change to the New Orleans Hornets, or the Rochester Royals turn to the Sacramento Kings. But the question is, why? Why are these franchises leaving? Is it a money problem? Is it fans' attendance? Or are the players just not happy? Well, today, we're not talking about those teams. We're talking about one of my beloved favorites, the Seattle Supersonics. Why today they are now the Oklahoma City Thunder, led by point guard Russell Westbrook and departed Mr. Kevin Durant, the Snake. So back to the Sonics. Why did they leave? That's the big question at hand here. Being a Seattle native, we're still kind of on that. Like, why aren't the Sonics here anymore? And let's just go through some of their history, because this team deserves to still be in Seattle, and I'm honestly not sure why. But in 1996, Sam Schulman and Eugene Klein, who actually owned the San Diego Chargers at the time, decided, hey, we want to bring a team to Seattle. And what's crazy is that we all think of the Sonics, the Seattle as 12th man because of the Seahawks, where we won the Super Bowl in 2013 and nearly won it in 2014, but instead we threw it to Ricardo Lockett instead of giving the ball to the best running back in the world, and that was Marshawn Lynch. So that sucked. But anyways, it was actually Seattle's first major league sports franchise, which was the Sonics in 1996, but they didn't start playing until 1997. They had their first winning record in 4 years, which is pretty good. Most teams take a little bit of time to get in the groove and whatnot. So that's pretty good. That's pretty dang good for a new team. But after 13 years, the Sonics finally won their first title in 1979 against the Washington Bullets. In 78, they went to the finals and played the Bullets, but they actually lost, which is sad. All their games from 1967 to 2008, they were played in Key Arena. In 1993, the Sonics were 63-19, best record in the West, but became the first team to lose to an 8th seed in the playoffs. And that was actually to the Nuggets. Screw the Nuggets. But yeah, that's definitely not a nice record we like to hold. But we still did win a championship in 13 years, which is pretty good. So I'm happy with that. That's somewhere in Key Arena, I still believe. But if you remember the Sonics back in their heyday, that's when you had Sean Kemp, Gary Payton, Detlef Schrempf, Nate McMillan, Hershey Hawkins. Oh my goodness, if I could go back and just watch them, I would. But that team was ferocious. I mean, taking on the 72-10 Bulls with Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. They did lose in 6 games because Sean Kemp couldn't make a freaking free throw. But it's still pretty cool to see that they got that far. And the Sonics were great. And what's crazy to me is that our head coach at the time, from 1992 to 98, was George Karl. He had the most winning percentages of a coach at Seattle, even though we had big-time coaches back in the past like Lenny Wilkens, who played for us and was a part of that Sonics 1979 championship. And his win percentage with the Sonics was over, I believe, 70% of games, so 70-30 win-to-loss margin. And what's crazy is that in 1998, he won head coach of the year, but because of some affiliation issues with management, he decided to part ways when they were going to renew his contract. And everyone in Seattle was like, what are you doing? This guy has gotten us to the finals, and we've been the number 1 seed in the West, the number 2 seed, and he's been absolutely phenomenal. And it kind of reminds me of this year, the Raptors. The Raptors fired head coach Dwayne Casey, and he was the number 1 seed for the Raptors. He had a great coaching year. He's now at Detroit because they're actually smart. They're like, well, I'm going to take this guy because he's coach of the year. But no one could get past LeBron, and so the Raptors were saying, well, since you can't get past LeBron, just like every other team, we're just going to fire you. So the Raptors have just been really dumb, especially trading DeMar DeRozan, but oh well. And actually, the last couple teams to relocate were the Vancouver Grizzlies in 2001 to Memphis, where they still are now, and then the Charlotte Hornets to the New Orleans Hornets, which now both teams are actually there, but it's the Pelicans in New Orleans, and then it's back to the Hornets in Charlotte. And Charlotte's my team, as you can tell by the Kemba Walker jersey, presented right behind me, as you know. So, and another kind of fun fact that I like to put in there, since being from Portland, Portland Trailblazers and the Supersonics had a rivalry, so it's called the I-5 rivalry, because we both share the same highway, so traveling up in there, it's pretty fun. But to sum up the Sonics, pretty much, it's crazy to think that this is a team that had over 6 Western Conference championships. They had a head coach of the year, some superstar phenomenal players like Sean Kemp and Gary Payton and Lenny Wilkins, and, of course, an NBA title. And we hadn't had a losing season. Our longest losing season streak was 2 years. Actually, 3 years, excuse me, from 2001 or 2002 to 2005. But then we got Ray Allen in a great trade from Milwaukee. We went to the playoffs and actually got to the second round. But for 2 years, we started to have a losing record. But then, number 2 draft in 2007, and we get Kevin Durant, Durantula. Oh my goodness. And rookie of the year. I mean, we only did win 25 games that year. But Kevin Durant had nobody. Name one person. Just give me one person that was on that team. I mean, I know who was on that team because I was a fan. But when you think of great time players and great time teams, you can usually think of one or two names, but you can't. So it's mind-boggling to me that they moved down to Oklahoma City. And the reason was the government wanted more money to reestablish Key Arena. It was old, but the government couldn't get it, and so it's crazy to me that couldn't happen. So here's a good and bad example of teams that have moved and didn't move, and why they shouldn't have, which is mind-boggling. So here's the Sacramento Kings. So the Kings have been there for a while now. Let's take a look at their history. So back in the day when they first established themselves, they were actually in Rochester, New York, back in 1949. It only took them 2 years to win the NBA championship, but since then, they have not won a title in 67 years. That's insane. We all know the Big O, Oscar Robertson, had the most triple-doubles in a season before Russell Westbrook broke that in 2016. The Kings moved to Sacramento in 1985, so they've been there for 33 years. And in those 33 years, they have not been that great. From that time, for a couple years, they're all right. You didn't know most players, but you remember back in the day when you got from the draft pick Jason Williams out of Florida, the man who was flashy and had the elbow pass in the All-Star game, and Chris Webber from the Fab Five of Michigan. Those guys were tight. I mean, that was fun to watch. But Jason Williams had some turnover issues and couldn't get some things going, so instead they traded Jason Williams up to Vancouver in exchange for Mike Bibby, who was a point guard for them. And then things started to really, really roll. And they had a league best that year in 2001, 2002, 61-21 record, and 36 out of their 41 home games they won, which is really good. And that year they lost to the Lakers in the Western Conference Finals in Game 7, I believe. Yes. And no championship has ever been won in Sacramento, which seems right. I can't think of any other Sacramento teams that are major league, but I could get back to that in the next one. But what's crazy to me and mind-boggling is that a lot of people in Sacramento have been talking, not now because it's been 17 years, but in that Game 6 where the Kings lost, there was 27, hear me straight, 27 free throws in the fourth quarter alone, where Shaq was getting fouled and Kobe Bryant. How do you shoot 27 free throws? That's 14 fouls. It only takes 7 to go into the bonus. That's, I don't even know. That's just insane to me. I can't even believe it. But David Aldridge, an ESPN analyst at the time, this is what he said. He said, There is nothing I can say that will explain 27 free throws for the Lakers in the fourth quarter, an amount staggering in its volume and impact on the game. It gave me pause. How can you explain it? How can you explain a game where Scott Pollard fouls out when he's 2 feet from Shaquille O'Neal, or that Doug Christie is called for a ridiculous touch foul just as Chris Webber spikes Bryant's drive to the hoop, or that Mike Bibby is called for a foul deep in the fourth quarter after Bryant pops him in the nose with an elbow? I can't argue with that. And it's funny because I think of Game 7s for the Kings, and it's their Achilles heel. For the next 3 years, they had a Game 7 loss. So here it is. Game 7, 2001 Western Conference Finals game against the Lakers, lost. Game 7 against the Dallas Mavs in 2002 and 2003 in the second round, lost. Then there's Game 7 against the Kevin Garnett-led Timberwolves in 2003-2004. What do you think? They lost. So it's crazy to me. And here's another weird thing that I'm seeing a kind of trend between the Raptors, the Sonics, and now the Kings is the head coach. Rick Adelman was the coach from 1998 to 2006. That's 8 years. And that time, they went to the playoffs 8 years straight. So this is a coach who's getting them to the playoffs. They haven't been that great of a franchise since opening in Rochester, and that's 8 years in a row. That's pretty dang impressive. And his overall record while being the head coach of the Kings was 395 wins, 229 losses. That's 63% wins and 30% losses, or 37%. That's incredible. That's a really good statistic for a head coach, especially in the NBA, a very difficult league to win. And once again, they didn't renew his contract, and the Kings were furious. They're like, what is going on here, pretty much, with coaching staff and coaches and not getting a deal done? And what's crazy is I think Rick Adelman, the loss of him has just crushed this franchise. Because since then, they have lost 12 years in a row, meaning they've had a losing record for 12 years since Rick Adelman has not been their head coach. Why wouldn't you renew a guy's contract who had gotten you to the playoffs 8 years in a row? Please tell me why. Why? That's 8 years of having a chance, and that I don't even know what to say anymore. I'm just going to sit here in silence because it's insane. 8 years. Playoffs. 1 Western Conference Finals. 3 first rounds. And 3 second rounds. And you don't renew a guy's contract. Brings a tear to my heart. And what's dumb is in 12 years they've had a losing record and that team is still there. My point about the Sonics, their longest losing streak was 3 years, and then they went to the playoffs with Ray Allen, and then 2 bad years, and you get Kevin Durant, and then you don't get enough money, so you ship him down to Oklahoma City? That's ridiculous. So ridiculous. But here's a good example. So the Vancouver Grizzlies, who were established in 1995 to 2001, and were brought in the same time as the Toronto Raptors. So I think it was the Vancouver Canucks, the hockey team owner wanted to open up a basketball franchise, but instead of just one team, they're like, well, let's put one in Toronto and let's put one in Vancouver. So, bam, you got the Grizzlies. They had the sweetest jerseys of all time, this nice teal color, brown and red, just like my logo. So they know a thing or two about having some pretty awesome colors. But what sucks is that the NBA really hindered the Grizzlies from being successful. In the first 3 years, they weren't allowed to have a lottery pick, which is the top 5 draft picks in the draft. And because they're expansion teams, they have to pick from all other 28 NBA teams, but the other teams can lock down pretty much 8 players on the roster. So they're basically getting the bottom of the barrel for who they want to have on their team. So they're already crappy, and they didn't pick any good players. Their first general manager was Stu Jackson. He was the coach of the Badgers and previously the Knicks from Well, I actually don't know, but he was the general manager for 5 years for the Grizzlies, but his winning record with the Knicks was not that great, so weird choice. And then Brian Winters was their first head coach, and he was actually 9 years as assistant coach to Lenny Wilkens of the Atlanta Hawks, but I mentioned Lenny Wilkens earlier because he was part of the 1979 NBA championship team with the Sonics, but it's funny that you have a guy who's under the wing for 9 years under an NBA great, and then he comes over to Vancouver, and it's just not the same. You just don't have that same mentality. You can be under greatness, but unless you really have it in you, it's just not there. And we saw that with the Grizzlies' really, really poor record. Their first season, they had 15 wins and 67 losses, an NBA record for the most losses, but what's a crazy statistic, I mentioned this in the last video when I interviewed Rockwell Tufte, is that on average, the amount of attendance for fans coming in each game was 17,183 people to each game, and that was 14th in the league. Now, there's 15 other teams that didn't have as many people going to the games, and what's shocking is that 5 of those teams were playoff teams, and the one right behind them were the Sonics, and that year was the year they were 64-18 and faced the Bulls in the finals, and they still had less people going to the games. I don't understand that, and it's weird because they had more than the Lakers, than the Clippers, the Sixers. These are established teams, playoff teams that are really good. So it's just shocking to me, and then I did some research on the actual percentages of how many people were coming, and the Grizzlies got over 96% of people to come because their actual stadium only could fill 17,300, and so that number's really, really close. So they were packing it. So it wasn't a money issue. It was just that they weren't winning, and the organization said, we got to move, and Memphis purchased them. But with these 3 teams, it's just crazy to see why some teams move and why others don't. Being a big Sonics fan, I, of course, am still shedding a tear from them moving down to Oklahoma City. I mean, I do like rooting for them because they're good, but it's not the same as actually having a team in the home state. And it's mind-boggling because you had a winning record, you had a title, and you still moved because we couldn't get money. But then there's the example of the Kings, 12 losing seasons in a row, and you still haven't moved. Because we talked about, or not myself, but the league was saying Sacramento could transition up to Seattle. Why not? I'll take them for sure. Get a new head coach and try something else. And then you have the Vancouver Grizzlies, who you saw. It wasn't working. You moved somewhere else, and that franchise has been really successful. You've had Marc Gasol and Mike Conley and a playoff regular team until this last year. But overall, the point is the NBA has to be more careful with where they choose to place teams and why they do that, because it's really crazy that the Kings are still around and the Sonics aren't around. Even Dwayne Wade said that if he had the chance to be an NBA owner, he'd be the Sonics. And Adam Silver said that Seattle Sonics are on a very short list of teams that they would bring back. Please do that. That would be so nice. And one quick last fact for you, which I'm honestly, I want to know the actual answer, but the NBA owners were given a vote to see should the Sonics move down to Oklahoma City right away or in 2 years, or should they stay permanently in Seattle, and the vote was 28-2. So 28 owners said move him to Oklahoma City, and 2 owners said keep him in Seattle. No surprise that Paul Allen was one of them. He's the owner of the Seattle Seahawks and the Trailblazers. And the other one, which was kind of weird, he's on Shark Tank, Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. So I want to shout out to him and maybe email him and go, hey, what was your reasoning for trying to keep Seattle in, and why haven't you made more of a push to keep him in? But this podcast was all just about why Seattle left and some teams that left or didn't leave and the strange reasons why franchises don't succeed. And what's crazy is both three teams between the Raptors, the Sonics, and the Kings, it's all had a weird coaching issue with head coach of the year and whatnot. So George Karl, Rick Adelman, Dwayne Casey, and then right after they win head coach of the year, they either get filed, have affiliations with management, or they just couldn't renew the contract. So I would love to dig deeper into that, but I wish I knew where they lived or whatnot, but I don't, sadly. Thanks for tuning in as always. Next week we'll update something. Probably going to do a football one, change of pace. And you guys have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.